As a child, I was lonely. We lived alone, my mother and I, far out in the wilderness. Unimaginable distance between us and civilization. The only kids I'd meet were my cousins, but they were quite a bit older than me, and tended to just avoid me whenever they came to visit, which was about once a year. They call me mean things, and throw stones at me until I'd eventually retreat under my bed crying. At some point, they just stopped visiting altogether. I was so alone. There was always just my mother and me. Granted, she loved me very much and would never let a day go by without expressing it, but I was getting older and felt a longing for companionship with someone my own age. I would question her constantly, nagging, begging for her to take me somewhere where there'd be other kids, but she would always decline, telling me it was too dangerous out there. No matter how hard I contested her decision, she would never listen, so I had to take the matter into my own hands. I would sneak out at night, exploring the area around our cabin for as far as I could in any direction, returning home just before dawn. I would suffer the exhaustion of sleeplessness gladly, if it meant I had just the slightest chance of encountering another human being. I did this every other night for 3 or 4 months, before finally stumbling over traces of human activity. It was a burnt-out campfire, probably 2 or 3 days old. Tracks on the ground suggested there were at least 3 distinct individuals, 2 adults and a child. My heart raced with adrenaline. I knew I had no way of tracking them down and getting home that night, so I had to make a decision. I could possibly, over the next few nights, map out their trajectory, but by then, there'd be a good chance they'd be long gone, or I could just not return home and follow the tracks immediately. I chose the latter. Now, I was used to roaming the wilderness. It was, after all, my home, so it didn't take me more than a few days to track them down. It was nearing dusk when I smelled the smoke from the campfire, and just over a mound, I spotted the campsite. I hid there until dark, watching their every move. They were beautiful, fair-haired, pale-skinned, blue-eyed, clean. They moved with the elegance and grace of angels, and I could smell their perfume lingering in the air, a scent of which would tickle my nostrils pleasantly. When they retreated into their tents, the red glowing embers from the campfire were the only source of light left. I crept closer. My heart was beating so fast, I was afraid I'd wake them up. I circled their campsite several times before I got up the nerve to creep closer. I knew by now they were sound asleep, but I was just so nervous. I figured I couldn't just wake them up. This was just a reconnaissance mission. My plan was to learn as much as possible about them, then maybe approach them the next morning. I silently unzipped their tent. Foolish, I know, but I just had to take a closer look. I stuck my head in carefully and stared at their sleeping bodies for minutes. Their skin was just so pale. It was like looking at the snow-covered plains midwinter. Transfixed by their beauty, I had failed to notice the smaller lump curled by the entrance. The little girl suddenly sat up, rubbing her eyes, and stared directly into my face. Panic struck. I stumbled backwards, almost rolling into the dying campfire. I was expecting the girl to scream or wake up her parents, or, well, anything. But instead, she stuck her head out of the tent curiously and smiled at me. I was just sitting there, staring at her, not quite knowing how to react. Eventually, she silently got out of the tent and sat down next to me. "You're one of them, aren't you?" the little fair-haired girl said. "The ones we hurt." I nodded slowly. That's what my mother always said. If they found us, they'd hurt us. "Don't worry," she said. "I won't hurt you." She smiled at me. I'd never seen beauty like that. I smiled back, tears rolling down my face. She got up and tugged my hand gently. "Want to play a game?" she asked. "Yes," I stammered. "More than anything." It was the best night of my life. We played together for hours, and I had never before felt that kind of joy. She was the sweetest girl, so kind and graceful and pretty, and she never once threw rocks at me or called me names. I was in heaven. We eventually sat down by a nearby lake and let our feet soak in the tepid water. She held my hand and we just sat there, enjoying the moment. It was then I saw my mother running towards us. My jaw dropped and my blood turned to ice. "Get away from her!" my mother yelled hysterically. "Get away!" My mind went into fully panic overdrive, and I leaped up to my feet instinctively. I let out an aggressive snarl in my mother's direction, her wild-eyed figure now looming above me menacingly. Without thinking, I shifted my position to shield the little fair-haired child. My mother's demeanor suddenly changed from anger to fear. I cocked my head in puzzlement. "I'm too late," she stammered as she edged away from me. "We must move. Now!" She started crying, hulking uncontrollably, and I saw the naked, primal fear in her eyes. I just stood there trembling, not able to comprehend what was happening. I looked down at the fair-haired girl and let out a shrieking wail as the horrible nature of our encounter was unveiled to me at last. She was no longer beautiful. It was a hideous perversion, an unspeakable abomination, something so depraved and vile that I staggered back in terror by the very hint of the sight. How? How could something so beautiful turn into something so ugly and heinous? "It's not your fault," my mother sobbed. "I should have told you." She bent down and lifted up the gruesome, mangled corpse of the once fair-haired little girl. I stared at my blood-soaked hands in shock. I could still taste her flesh on the back of my tongue, remember the sweet sensation as her heartbeat slowly faded and her body went limp. Feel the joy as I ripped her to shreds, torn limb from limb violently. I stood there trembling, letting it all sink in, my black heart beating frenetically. Eventually I collapsed, my body no longer responding. This wasn't me, I thought. This couldn't be me. My mother disposed of the girl to the best of her ability, like all the times before, just another person gone missing in the wilderness. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. Her parents never got closure. They never knew how close they were to the horror she endured, how close to death they came that night. I never understood how different I was. My mother wouldn't let me feel different. She just kept me as far away from people as she could. "They killed my father," she said, "just because he was different, just because he couldn't help himself. I was like him, beautiful, but in constant danger." She asked me if I understood now, understood why I could never do anything like that again. I said I did, and I never have, until now. Yesterday, my mother died. She'd been sick for a long time, so I knew the day was coming. Her body is now one with the ashes of our cabin. I write this as a warning. I am coming. I will no longer hide. I have suffered your hate for 30 years. It is time you suffered mine.